You may or may not be aware, but the government has been shut down for about a month now. And for most of us, we are completely unaffected because we don't need the government. Our lives are going on as usual. But for millions of Americans, they're actually at risk of being able to put food on the table as a result of this shutdown. And that is because millions of Americans are at risk of losing food stamps. And the current administration is saying that it will not be using emergency funds to pay for this food aid. Now, millions could mean anything, but it turns out that right now there are over 40 million Americans on food stamps. 40 million Americans who are about to lose access to those food stamps. Now, this is enraging both sides of the aisle right now. On one side, you have people extremely upset that there are 42 million Americans who are potentially not going to be able to put food on the table within a matter of days. On the other side, you have a bunch of people who are upset that there are 42 million Americans on food stamps. Just in case we need some context for that number, right now the population of the United States is 340 million. We can do some quick math, 340 million people divided by 42 million people on food stamps, and see that approximately 1 out of every 8 people is currently on food stamps. Now, I can already hear the comments flying in about this, so let me make my position on this 100% clear. I believe that those who have the resources have the moral obligation and responsibility to care for those around them, especially the people who are in the most need. This is the fundamental reason why parents are supposed to care for their children. We have a responsibility to care for those who cannot care for themselves. And the more means you create for yourself, in other words, the more responsibility, the bigger the burden, the more you produce and the more wealth you create, I believe the larger your responsibility is to care for more and more and more of those people around you. Now, I would prefer that this be voluntary, and I believe that that is the only moral way to do so. A rock is not moral for telling it to stay put. It has no choice. Therefore, charity via mass theft, in other words, taxation with no ability to opt out, is not moral regardless of where the destination is of those funds that were confiscated. Theft can never equal charity because it is involuntary. However, I don't make the rules. I only report on the rules and the results of those bad rules. And so I personally give to charity myself because I believe it is the right thing to do. And I think if a government is going to tax its citizens, then one of the best things that it can do with that money is to take care of people who cannot take care of themselves. The question is, are these people on food stamps really those people who cannot take care of themselves? After all, are 1 in 8 of the entire US population unable to put food on the table? That seems like a pretty high percentage of the population, roughly 12%, especially when you consider that the median household income in the United States is $83,000. When I began my career, I was making $40,000 per year. My wife stayed at home with our newborn. We lived in an apartment that cost around $900 per month, and we had nothing left over. We had no debt. We shopped all the discounts, clipped all the coupons, and if prices of gas or eggs or something else unexpectedly rose, we didn't have the budget in order to afford it. Now, this was some years ago, and it was definitely before the trillions of dollars of money printing that took place in 2020 and 2021, which meant it was also before all of the inflation that's taken place since then. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I would expect that a household with 1 or 2 kids making $83,000 per year right now would feel like they are in the same situation that I felt like I was in when I first started out. Yes, we're fine from month to month, but man, there is no wiggle room here. Which means that if I were to be on food stamps in that situation, it would feel like a breath of fresh air. It would feel like a little bit of a burden lifted off my shoulders. It would feel like maybe if I had become a little bit dependent or reliant on that maybe I wouldn't be able to survive without it. And it turns out that the vast majority of people who are on food assistance programs one way or another, they're not getting thousands of dollars per month. I know that a lot of us have seen the videos of the people who are complaining about their benefits getting cut, about not being able to afford the expensive groceries that they're just splurging on. And it can make us feel resentful that those of us who are producing and creating wealth wealth and working hard have money taken away from us to hand out to people who aren't working. I just don't think that's the majority case. USDA.gov shows that Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program provides average benefits of $187.20 per participant per month. When you are barely scraping by, an extra $180 for groceries is definitely not going to make you feel like you can splurge on all the expensive groceries, getting the steaks instead of the chicken, getting the pre-made stuff instead of the raw ingredients to cook yourself. But it absolutely is going to provide some breathing room. Certainly, there are going to be abusers in any system that is run by the federal government. There's going to be opportunity for corruption and to abuse the system. But with the average participant getting $187 per month, it is likely the outlier, not the rule, especially because averages are skewed by the top end, which means the median is lower than 187. Median is the middle participant, and so it is a much better representation of what the typical person in the group will get. The average, though, is calculated by adding up all of the totals and then dividing by the number of participants, which means if you do have some outliers who are receiving a ton, then the average will be skewed up by those making more, which is why earlier I showed you the median household income and not the average household income, which is much, much higher, skewed by people that have a lot higher incomes, even though there are not that many of them. Now, it's also worth noting that this is actually a very small percentage of the US government's budget. Fiscal year 2024, the United States government spent about $100 billion on SNAP, which is only 1.5% of the entire federal budget. When we break it down by category, you can see that the federal government spends 50% more than that on transportation, almost quadruple that on veterans benefits and services. And when you're looking at the big categories, you're really looking at the big six, which is primarily Social Security, Medicare, health, net interest, and national defense. Now, just those big six by themselves are already more than the entire tax revenue, which means the US government would still run a deficit. They'd still have to borrow more than they tax in order to cover all their spending if they eliminated every single other category of spending and only kept those six: Social Security, Medicare, defense, net interest on the debt. So the amount that they spend on food stamps is literally a drop in the bucket. This is not where the majority of your tax dollars are being wasted. In fact, if you want to talk about something that is extremely immoral and unfair, consider the fact that age and wealth are so highly correlated together that they are basically the same thing. There is no tighter correlation in economics or social studies than age and wealth together. And that's very obvious because the longer you live, the more chance you have to accumulate wealth and to build new skills in order to increase your income. So the older you are, the wealthier you are going to be on average. And yet, it is these people who are receiving the vast majority of taxpayers' money, taxpayers who are the young, poorer, working people. Things like Medicare and Social Security are literally, not figuratively, they are literally wealth transfer systems where the government forcefully takes money away from young, poor, working people and just hands it to old, retired, wealthy people. And it is a fact, it is not an opinion, that most of these people do not need this assistance. They appreciate it and they like it because the government took money away from them for their entire working career, but it is supplementing their retirements, and for over 50% of retirees, they are not touching the principal or the interest on their own retirements, which means the inheritances of those richer people being able to pass on those large inheritances to their beneficiaries is directly being subsidized by young, poor working people. Because without that, they would have to actually use what they saved up. And it is largely because of this insane tax burden, especially on working people that have not had time to save up wealth or increase their income skills and have kids at home, that they are reliant on programs like food stamps. How much more would people be able to provide for themselves if the government wasn't taking half of everything they earned all year long just to give to other people who are already retired, not working anymore, so that they don't have to work and so that they don't have to touch their retirement accounts? Like I said at the beginning of the video, I believe it is the responsibility of those who can to provide for those who can't. I think it should be voluntary, but even if it is done through the tax system, we definitely shouldn't be taking money away from people who can barely provide for themselves in order to fund the retired, non-working lifestyles of people who can, especially when it puts those younger people into a position where they now cannot provide for themselves. Food stamps are not the issue with the government. Food stamps are not the issue with Americans. Yes, there are 42 million Americans, 1 out of every 8. That is 12% of people who are at least somewhat dependent on food stamps. Given the average person gets $187 a month from this, and it is less than 2% of the entire federal budget, I think this is something worth overlooking. There are bigger fish to fry here. There are bigger immoralities taking place. And that if we are going to have tax-based wealth redistribution, it should be going towards the direction of the people that need the help, not the other way. And I'd like to close by saying that freedom and independence are different, but they are directly tied together. Freedom is simply the absence of control. In other words, you are able to make your own decisions and your own choices. Nobody else can force you to do one thing or another, so long as you are not forcing other people to do things. In other words, your rights end where somebody else's rights begin. Independence simply means you are not dependent on somebody else for survival. And the reason why the words freedom and independence are conflated so often is because they go together. In other words, if you are dependent on somebody else, you lack freedom. When you need somebody else to survive, they control you. There's an old story in the book of Genesis in the Bible about the descent of the Egyptians from freedom into tyranny as they gave up their responsibilities and relied on the government to provide for them through a famine. The end of the story is they all became slaves, and that was the origin of taxation. The less dependent you are on somebody for survival, the freer you will be. And that comes with responsibility that many people don't want to bear, but the life is better that way. And so if you desire freedom and you desire that responsibility that accompanies freedom, you must become independent, which means despite the fact that the government takes half of everything you make every year, and despite the fact that they are robbing you through inflation and prices are going up, that it is up to you to escape it. It's not your fault the system feels rigged against you, but it is your responsibility to climb your way out. Nobody else is going to do it for you. In fact, the more you rely on other people to do it for you, the less free you will be. It is difficult, but it is not impossible, and I promise you, it is worth it. As always, thank you for watching. Have a great day.